by Rob, wanting to have a deeper conversation about the ideas around intersectionality. So the rules for this one is a little different from the Hippy Dippy podcast. There's not really, unless it was prescribed beforehand, there's not really like the same 1 minute intros or anything. You can just go straight into it. I'm just here to make sure that if anybody's talking over somebody else uh, too much, I step in, and that which I didn't do too well last Friday, but that's for another topic. And basically, if somebody's not getting enough time to talk, I'll be able to just throw it over that way. Again, I'll do, as always, do my best to be as unbiased as possible, and I'm happy to be hosting this conversation. So you two can take it away on this topic. I know you've talked more specifics in the DM chat, so you guys can just take it away.
I think we should do intros. Like, I think everyone
Intros,
should clarify like their
yeah.
position and themselves, because like I don't know how many people know me. I
Oh,
don't know
yeah.
how many people know Rob. So,
Okay, that's fair.
I guess I'll let Rob go first.
Okay, sure. Yeah, no problem. So, yeah, my name's Rob Noor. I have a channel. I'm on Twitch now as well, but I'm also on YouTube, Periscope. You can find me on DLive as well. And it's Normal America with Rob Noor. I'm someone who ran for office in a special election for Congress in District 12 in Pennsylvania in 2019. There was a special election because someone got ill and had to leave their seat before the election. So I ran as a Republican there. I will be running again in 2022. I basically started my channel because I feel that there's so many people in this country, whether it be in rural America like where I live, or it be in the inner city, that just don't have a voice. And I also wanted to try to talk about politics in a way that you don't have to watch 8 hours of news every day, or, you know, be reading political theory books to kind of try to understand. So that's how I got in this. Some of my background is I was a debater in college. I got a degree from a small state school in Pennsylvania called Clarion University. I debated for 4 years there, made it to the national debate tournament, which I was really proud of. And we talked a lot about things. This would have been, I'm an old man at this point. I just had a birthday. I'm 36. So we talked about these things back in 2003, 2004 was when I was first introduced to a lot of the ideas of intersectionality and people like bell hooks. And so I did a lot of debating this subject back then. So I just thought it'd be really interesting to kind of pick up this conversation because I think it's really important, and we're seeing a lot of this manifest in kind of our politics outside of academia as well. And Mel seems someone who's very knowledgeable about it, so I thought it would be great to have a discussion on that. So,
and we just started already, and he's given me a resume. He's given me lots of examples to pretty much show that, hey, I'm blown the fuck out. All right. Hello, everyone. My name's Holly. I hang out on the internet and hang out in Twitch politics, unfortunately, because I'm a sadist, and I may like this. I'm not quite sure how I feel about it. My background is essentially I'm just a working class Joe Schmo like everyone else. I live in middle rural America, kind of, adjacent. And I basically just talk about communism and like POC stuff and queer stuff sometimes. It just depends, but I don't really try to deep dive into it too much. I usually just kind of hang out in the panel scene and just give like perspective analysis to whatever the discussion is, but I try to not specialize in anything specific. I usually just try and be the jack of all trades kind of girl when it comes to discussing things. But yeah, I think intersectionality is like a crucial part to help everyone sort of understand where everyone is in the realms of privilege and sort of social movement. I think it should just be used as like a tool, not necessarily like a categorization or like we shouldn't use it as like a buzzword. It should literally just be something that like we use to examine everyone's privileges and everyone's situations and use it to basically atomize what the problems are and what solutions we can come up with going forward. I think it's become a buzzword by a lot of liberals, and it's also become a weaponized buzzword by like a lot of people on the right, and it kind of detracts from the original creation of the term. So that's really where I stand on it. I just think it's like important.
Do you mind if since I think that one of the problems with discussions like this is oftentimes a lot of these terms can mean different things to different people. So would you mind if I ask you how you would define intersectionality as a good starting point?
Okay, so I guess we could define it like from like a Merriam-Webster dictionary term. So like essentially like the dictionary term is the cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as like racism, classism, you know, the isms that we all hate, combine, overlap, and intersect especially in the experiences of marginalized groups. This goes back to the Crenshaw theory of intersectionality, which is basically just examining where inequality lies and how we look at those inequalities. So, for example, I would say that when I talk about oppression, I don't like to stack oppression. So I think it's really disingenuous to be like to walk into a conversation. So, like for clarity's sake, for everyone here, I'm a person of color, I'm queer, and I'm trans. So if you look at that, a lot of people will say, "Oh, well, you're just virtue signaling, or you're basically just saying like, look how oppressed I am." And I'm like, I'm not really trying to say that. What I'm saying is there are a lot of things that, depending on where I am, who I interact with, who I talk to, what situations I'm placed in, I might be more affected because of these crossovers with my existences than other people, or I might be less than. And so I don't like to use it as an oppression Olympics, but I know some people do. And I know a lot of people on the right like to assume that when we talk about our listings of our existences that we are talking about oppression. And I don't think we are. And I do get that a lot from a lot of people on the right. So that's really where I sit with it.
Okay, so it'll be difficult for me because I will say much of my preparation and which to the limited extent what it is, and much of the problems I have with intersectionality is how it is used in the way you're claiming that you don't use it, which is kind of this oppression stacking that we see, or this oppressive acts that we could see that's directed at. Go ahead.
Well, I would say that the oppression stacking is such a minority like voice in this conversation that it doesn't actually reflect at all like what this term was designed by. Like as someone who was like around the era of when it was developed in the 80s, I would expect you would know like what the original like purpose of this was. Like when the feminism boom in the 80s and 90s happened, the idea of introspection and intersectionality was something that was needed in mainstream society and actually originated from a lot of black feminists who were basically tired of social movements being hijacked by specific people and not really paying attention to everyone. Because I mean, as equality happens, as we push forward in equality, sometimes we forget about other people. So, like for example, when gay people have the right to marry, we kind of forget about the other things in queer struggle, like Medicaid, medical access, education, and jobs. People were so wrapped up in like wanting to pass gay marriage and equality and like love is love and shit, but we like completely forgot that like it doesn't matter if I can get married to another girl if I can't get health coverage. Why the hell does it matter? And so that's what I always talk about is like I like equality broadly speaking, but a lot of times when we push for oversweeping equality laws, even like the Civil Rights Act, we often forget about the people we are advocating for on the back end. I don't know if you know this, but the Voting Rights Act actually got expanded in 1972, which allowed the permissive voting. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. It allowed Asian Americans and Native Americans the right to vote, especially women. Actually, Native women weren't allowed to vote, I believe, until like 1965 or something like that. So not everyone was guaranteed, or not 1965, 1975. So it's close. It's close. I'll have to like look that up. But essentially, like whenever a law gets passed that grants equality, not everyone has that equal access because people like either don't think about the law or they're so focused on getting like the big thing. Like, okay, so let's get all the black folks able to vote. But a lot of people forgot about women. They forgot about people in different gender categories. Like, how are those people counted? So that's all that really is. It's just a self-examining of how do we strengthen equality.
Okay, so first off, to the extent that I was around in the 80s, I would have been 5 at the end of the 80s, so I'm not that old quite. But I can tell you when I was in college as a younger person and was first running into these sorts of investigations from people like bell hooks and things like that, that this actually is more common than not that I see it being used in terms of discussing oppression. And I think one of the things that I see being used with intersectionality a lot is the idea of talking about subjective experience being important, in fact, even more so than objective truth. And that's really where I start to see the problems with intersectionality. For example, everything you just said there, I could totally...
What is your what is your measurement for objective truth? So, like for example, like can you give me like data or an example of how it's being weaponized? Like I don't see it.
Yes, it depends on what you mean by data. Can I give you an exact number of someone that's done a study that said it was used
Well, no,
1,380?
that's not what I'm asking.
Right.
No, what I mean by data is like if you're making a claim, for example, that people are running. Okay, I don't want. I'm going to be careful about how I say this, but this is kind of true to an extent. So the idea of like the shrieking blue-haired liberal that's like everything is terrible. I don't think this example really truly exists as often as people think. I really feel that like we see it blown up by certain media figures. So like people tend to look at that and they fixate on this specific person, and so they kind of attach this belief onto people that say look like X. You know, like I mean, look, I got a piercing in my nose, I got dyed hair, I'm a trans person. Like I am the definition of what conservatives think of as like the scary liberal that's taking away their rights and their guns. You know, like I am that person to a lot of these folks. So like, and I just gave you an example that was completely different than what you would expect this example to come from. So, and I
Well,
talk with a lot of people all across the political spectrum, and I find more often than not, it's mostly people on the right that have this idea of intersectionality. And I've talked to so many people on the left and even centrists and even like libertarians that are very much just like, no, guys, it's not that. Like, I mean, even the dictionary definition talks about nothing about what you're even implying. So I'm just curious to how you got to that conclusion.
because I've seen it firsthand, and I could give example after example. For example, if you go to the website Fire, which is an organization that's dedicated towards free speech on campus, there are hundreds of cases every year when people of a particular political bent, especially conservatives, are being censored from campus speech. We could see major after major that is dedicated to overthrowing the systemic struggles of white supremacy, of patriarchy. We could see, even in the current protests we see now,
Would you
the
argue that
idea of
patriarchy is
Oh,
bad?
let's let Rob finish first.
no, I'm saying that though that these are examples of how we see intersectionality being used. For example, the book White Fragility, that's become a coffee table book for most of the establishment at this point, that was written by a political consultant that talks about how white people all suffer from this thing, fragility. And there we see constant problems that are coming up with this kind of cancel culture and the idea that intersectionality is pushing, which groups us into categories, saying one group, you know, depending on race, gender, things like that. One group is oppressors and the other group is oppressed. And it's
Well,
go
we
ahead, I'll
look at
finish it.
history. Sure. Okay, so white fragility. Okay, so I'm not a huge fan of that book, and I will say I'm not a fan of the book because I think it gives a very unnuanced and very watered down version of things that I talk about on a daily basis. I will agree it does it is a guide. I feel like it's a dummy's guide um, for white folks that that haven't had the chance to confront privilege in a real way. Um, and I think the result of the racialized violence in America and sort of the pushback to a lot of things happening like lately has gotten a lot of white people to maybe rethink how they view privilege and oppression. Do you think it's bad that people like that white folks are finally looking introspectively at oppression? Like, do you like I guess I'm not quite sure what that point was about. Like, are you saying this is a bad thing or a good thing, or what are you kind of where are you addressing?
Yes, anytime that you say that a particular group has some sort of sin or something like that because of purely the color of their skin, that becomes a negative. And we end up seeing this situation where all of a sudden, instead of fighting the actual oppression we see for people in the establishment that have been screwing over working class people in this country for 60 years, we start to get divided on racial lines. And we end up, intersectionality leads to all sorts of insane arguments, such as LeBron James, one of the most privileged people in the history of the world, who won the genetic lottery, who is an absolute maybe the best
How did he
athlete in
win?
the. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
How did he? How did he win the genetic lottery?
Because he's a physical freak. I mean, his body. He probably is the most gifted athlete in the history of the world. Like, yes, he did a lot of practice and preparation, but his genetics, someone like Michael Phelps as well, their genetics are so unbelievable. LeBron James could have played any professional sport he wanted. And so, by virtue purely of how he
But
was
like,
born, he was able to achieve to
I
become one of the most powerful men in the history of the world.
I mean, but that's I don't. Why is this a genetic argument? Like, why can't we just chalk it up to like the institutions that push people to be star athletes? Like, I've read so many books. I love to listen to like the ESPN like 30 for 30 podcast. I'm like super huge into sports, like in my off time, and so every time I've ever like looked at athleticism in America, it's very much like an engineered system. So like when you show promise and you show talent, they kind of put you in this pipeline to engineer you to just be good at the craft and to be good at the sport. I don't think being born has anything to do with it. I don't think it's a genetics thing. I think being born at the right time, in history, or being like with the right people, um, and like just someone being gifted at a sport. I don't want to boil that down to just genetics. That just seems like a really silly argument to make.
Well, it's
And
not
like I don't
just
think that
it's not
makes
just
like how does that like
genetics. There's certainly other things that go into. But the point is this: LeBron James certainly was born with a lot of talent. Certainly, I've no doubt the man probably practiced incessantly and has achieved greatness.
what is
But
born what
if
is
I could just
born
real quick,
talent, though?
the reason I bring it up is because LeBron James will talk about how other people have privilege in ways that he doesn't, which is ironic because he's one of the most privileged people in the history of the
Well,
world. And so we have these
still,
odd questions of if there is a discussion of privilege based on race, is someone who is a homeless white person more privileged than LeBron James because LeBron's black?
okay. So my pushback to that is it doesn't change the fact that even if you're a rich black man, you are still subjugated to like the same circumstances through through racialized ideologies. So let me clarify. So what about these black senators that are on their way to DC, right? They live outside of DC, they live in Virginia or Baltimore, what have you. They're just driving to work and they get stopped by the cops and they have really awful interactions. These are powerful people. These are elected officials. And they're still getting like racialized bias. So how can you like it's the argument that because someone has wealth, I would say now, I will concede and say that yes, if you're a minority person and you have money, then obviously you're going to have a kind of privilege, but that privilege isn't based on what you look like. That privilege is based on class. So like if you are a black businessman or a black capitalist, you still can succumb to the same racialized biases by like United States and white supremacists and shit like that. But at the end of the day, like yes, you do have more than the average person, and it doesn't. And when we talk about privilege in this way, we're more looking at it through class. Like I think we have to sort of separate this. Like you're kind of throwing it all in a blender and just like assuming that these are all like mutually exclusive, but they're not.
Well, that's the whole point of intersectionality, though, where it says that we need to take all of the oppressions against you, or you as your specific
That's
identity.
not what. That's really not what I read this definition to be. Like, do you want me to read the definition
Sure,
out loud again?
sure, read it again.
So, the Merriam-Webster definition just says it's the complex and cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, as in the isms, or racisms, or sexisms, combine and overlap and intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized individuals and groups. It's just a tool to look at. I don't think anywhere in that definition it's saying cherry pick things and make cases for why this person is less privileged than that person. I don't think anyone uses it that way. I
But
would I would agree that LeBron James is a privileged person because he is an athlete that has political athletes have political power in the United States, is in they have celebrity. He has vast amounts of wealth that most people don't have access to. He has access to like medical care and like anything in the world because of that. But that's not based off of race. That's literally based off of wealth and power and class.
okay, but
He
here's
is
the
the
thing,
bourgeois.
right?
He's
But
not like an elite. He's just a guy with a dude. He's just a guy with a lot of money, and everybody knows in the United States, if you got a lot of money, dog, you can do whatever you want, man.
okay,
Like I'm like even if you're homeless and have no address and you kill someone, if you pay someone enough money to get out of that shit, I mean, boy, you go do it. Like that's what I'm saying. Like I don't want to focus on like the fact that like yes, he is black. This is a thing we can talk about. Hell yeah, I get it. But like what I see when I hear this argument all the time is that it's he is bourgeois. He has wealth. He has access to wealth that the average person does not have. Look at Magic Johnson, who had AIDS. Why is he not dead yet? Well, this guy has so much money that he can afford the outrageous costs of AIDS treatments. Most people that get AIDS, that hit when the AIDS crisis hit, were poor gay men that didn't have access to medical care, and they died by the dozens because they were considered, even in society, not people that were equitable of care. That's how this works. A lot of times, just pure capital is what separates the haves and the have-nots. It's not always race. Race is an interesting component to this, but it's not the end-all be-all, which is why I say that they're not mutually exclusive. which is why I'm very confused why you're fixating on the two things like race and genetics. It just sounds weird. It just
Well,
sounds like a really weird
I would like
thing
to throw this back to Rob.
focus on.
Okay, so first up, the genetic. All I'm making is the argument that intersectionals make is based on how you look or what your race is. You could have certain privilege that others don't. So therefore, it's something beyond your control. In other words, genetically, the way you were born, the tone of your skin endows you with some sort of privilege or not. I was merely making the point that the same thing could be said of someone who is incredibly physically gifted person, that they also, through genetic, receive some sort of privilege that because they have the privilege to be able to go out and be a tremendous athlete and then be able to become very powerful economically and politically because of that. So it's not that I'm making any claim of genetics as far as I'm saying that it's the intersectional that want to focus on the genetics, not me. I don't say people have original sin because of their skin color or that they should be looked down upon or have to apologize for something based on their skin color. Secondly, we'll get into specifics, the idea of privilege based on race and how even that narrative through intersectionality is incorrect. Let me go. You talked for a little while, so just let me, I'm trying to encapsulate everything you said. But I just think that it's kudos to you if you're not someone doing this. I think, though, that the argument you're making there is basically an argument that I've been making against sort of the racial focus that we've seen that's been occurring for the past month, which is that instead of focusing along racial lines, the predominant privilege in this country is people that have power through having great amounts of wealth and things like that. And so we could be looking at how those people that have that power really control our system, and working class people of all races have been ignored by our system for about 60 years. Instead, the same establishments that are cheering on the Black Lives Matter narrative are focused on saying, hey, we think you're a bad person if you say Black lives don't matter. We think that books like White Fragility are a great thing. So they're making it about race so that they could ignore the discussion about power and about class. And this is a revolution that's using intersectionality to be a revolution from the top, supported by Starbucks, Nike, celebrities, all of these politicians. It's supported by all these people in positions of power to go after middle class, working class people and drive a wedge in them based on things such as race. And the last thing I'll say is when you talk about the idea of, well, black senators being stopped on their way. But again, that's sort of a racism of the gaps argument where we assume they were stopped merely from being black. Now, I'm not going to deny that that might not happen at some point, but it ignores the fact that there are also people that are pulled over of other races, other genders, etc., that are pulled over for garbage reasons as well. And most of the time, it has to do with being poor. But that's often ignored. Study after study show that when implicit bias trainings are done at work, in a work environment, it doesn't really solve the idea of people having a negative view of people of opposing races. The only people that end up with a more negative view are poor working class white people, because the idea is, well, they have some sort of privilege and they're still failing. So I think that intersectionality and the focus on breaking us into groups based on immutable characteristics and then assigning a position of privilege to some of those groups and a position of victimhood on other groups always is bad, always causes division, and ends up making people purely member of the group as opposed to an individual.
Okay. So like the only so I guess we could chalk up like geneticist arguments, like, so like we could talk about like ableism in the sense that like, yes, there are people, like if you're a more able-bodied person, you can obviously do more things than someone who's not able-bodied. But I don't think when people talk about, like, I've never met a disability advocate who goes around and criticizes people that can walk if you can't walk. Like I've never. I'm so curious to know where you've heard all these things, because as someone who's been in political activism for the last 10 years, I've never heard any of these arguments. I've never heard anyone say this.
You've never seen someone with extreme privilege talk about other people's privilege.
I've heard everyone talk about privilege because I think privilege is a thing we need to talk about, but I don't think anyone's having those specific conversations that you're saying.
So what? I didn't say anything about advocate for the disabled talking about people that could walk. I didn't say anything about that.
You're like trying to conflate this idea that like everyone is just like shilling all these like weird crazy arguments here. Like when black folks still get pulled, like they still get disproportionately pulled over by cops. It has nothing to do with the fact that they're like. It literally has everything to do with the fact that there's racism in this country and that they're black. There's
no proof of that. For example, like this, and this is a discussion we had.
how is there not proof that black people suffer disproportionately, like racially in this country? Like, what do you mean?
That's the racial parts, what there's not proof of. For example, the last discussion we had, like this would be no different than a white supremacist saying.
Do you want me to pull up studies? Like
The stats, listen, the stats will say that they're pulled. I think the most recent stat I read was from CNN that said blacks were 12% more likely to be pulled over for things like traffic tickets. But we also had government agencies that said that they found that there was no racial bias in that, and it was that those people that
the government agency. Can you bring me like the source here? Like, I mean, I have sources if you want me to bring them up. Like,
sure,
I have studies.
You're welcome to bring the sources up, but again, what I'm saying is that there's no proof that racism is the reason for that. For example, we often hear the stat that blacks are 2.5 times more likely to be shot by police officers than whites. But a 2015 study from Harvard showed that actually being an unarmed white, you were more likely to be shot by a police officer than being an unarmed black. And that maybe the reason that there was more violent interactions with the police is because in particular inner city communities that happen to have black people live in them, there is more violence that occurs. Now, it would be to just bring up the study, if I would just say the infamous 1350 number that 13% of the black population commits 50% of homicides, you could be a white supremacist and be a bigot and use that and say, aha, that proves that black people are somehow more violent. But I think that's a huge mistake.
That's what you're posturing, though. Like, that's the thing that's amazing.
Well, let me finish. Let me finish then to explain that I'm not posturing that. So I think that that's incredibly heinous. I think that we as a country and both parties have failed these inner city black communities. And we need to look at the reasons that 1350 number exists. But if a white supremacist will just say, the data's there, that proves that black people are more violent. I refuse to accept that. In the same token, when you cite a study that says, well, black people are more likely to be pulled over by police, I take the exact same approach where I say, okay, well, let's look deeper. What are some of the possible reasons for that? And I'll concede that possibly racism could be part of that reason. But I think that too often we just point to a data set and say, aha, that proves racism, when that's not the true fact.
So you're saying you disagree with the white supremacists, right?
Yes.
So you're saying, like, you disavow with these people.
Yes.
But then, like, if I were to bring you a study that actually talks about racism, and how, like, if we look at some numbers and we look at, like, hey, like, these look a little sus here, you're still saying that, like, you're still conflating that it could be racism. Like, what is it then?
Okay, but listen, I think that your own arguments here kind of prove what I'm saying that the problem with intersectionality is. For example, you previously admitted. Well, I'll tell you, just one second. You previously admitted that it's majoritarily a class problem, that we could look at things like money, and having money is the big issue that could get you off of... I said
for that specific example, it's a class problem. Okay. I'm not saying overall. I'm saying that this is like something that a lot of people fail to recognize, because class reductionism is common, even among leftist circles. Okay. What I'm saying is you have to look at the disparity between rich and poor always. But at the same time, though, skin color does affect those disparities, like, just as much. The thing is, if I was a class reductionist, I would basically say the only thing that separates everyone is just class. So, like, you are either bourgeois, or you're like proletarian or whatever. And then if I were to be intersectional, I would say, like, okay, we can look at someone who is a minority with a lot of money, and, like, they are still co-opting the same systems of capitalism that are still oppressing people within their own class and their own groups of people. So what I'm saying is, like, it's not good on both sides of the coin. So I never did say that. I'm saying that, like, the bad take is to just reduce it to just class only. The good take, and why you need intersectionality, is you can examine why these things all intersect. Like, that's the whole point of this. Like, I feel like you're kind of...
But again, but I see that you're saying that, but then by the same token, you say, well, if there's a data set, then it proves racism. But couldn't it just be...
I never said that. I said I have data that can help us examine it. So, like, okay, so let me talk about when I think of data. Data is something that is useful. I'm not going to, like, because, like, essentially a data is just a fuck ton of anecdote Andes collected together. That's essentially what data is. And so when we look at data, we basically just take it all and we go, look, what trends are we noticing? And usually when those trends are kind of pushing in one direction, we look at the positives and the negatives. It's like, it's sampling, shit like that. Now, the interesting part about data is data is not always correct. So the thing about data is you have to make sure that you're talking to the people that are going through that. So when I read a piece of data and I look at a bunch of stats, I go, okay, who was polled, what time they were polled, what was politically going on when they were polled, what situations are happening, because there's a lot of biases and variables that can conflate data. So I don't like to just look at a stat and go, this proves this is correct. Now, if it's a certain stat that like is really really strong and there's no sort of dispute, then yeah, of course, then we can change that, I guess. But for the most part, you can't just look at data and go, this is true. I never said that. I never was pushing that argument.
Okay, well, fair enough. Thank you for the clarification, but it still becomes problematic because then it seems like, well, I understand that you're arguing in good faith, but you could see how people could say, well, I'll choose to accept data when I feel it fits a certain narrative, but other times I'll question where that data comes from. My argument with data is that
I always question where data comes from.
Okay, well, me too. So that's good. So let me just say, this is a discussion that I think is getting away from intersectionality. So let me just say, in good faith, I really mean this. I will accept that there is, because you're black, you probably have a more difficult time with law enforcement.
Why do you have to accept that? Why can't you realize that it has become a material reality?
Because there's about a 10-hour conversation we could have as to what came first, the chicken or the egg. Is the conflicted situations between inner cities and particular inner city black communities with police, is that situation because police are racist or we have systemic racism? Or is that situation because...
What about sundown towns? Can you, I live in rural America, for example. I live in bumfuck nowhere. And there are still towns in the United States that basically still treat these places as sundown towns. So if you're black or a person of color and you drive through it at certain times, they'll give you mean looks. People will pull out guns.
The same true. You think that when I crossed the street in Youngstown to get my hair cut and that I found myself in a community where I look different than everyone else, that I didn't get strange looks? Of course I did. So again, this is a problem with intersectionality. We assume that there is a holistic argument. One group is constantly a victim.
This is an intersectionality argument. This is me just saying, hey, this is just an experience that I've seen. It's an experience that I have experienced. I've been into some bumfuck towns in the middle of nowhere. And I've was with my girlfriend at the time, and I've definitely had a bunch of old white farmer dudes not like that shit. And I'm Asian. Now imagine if I was black. I think that conversation and that sort of that thing would have been a completely different interaction. And I recognize that because I am not black, most of the experiences that I have, in terms of racialized violence or oppression or anything that can happen to me, are marginally worse than the things that happen to black folks.
But again, this is again a problem I have with intersectionality. It's talking about. Just listen, please. Let me get through a thought, and then you can respond. You're talking about subjective. I have personally seen this with your anecdotal subjective evidence, but the intersectionality would say, that shows that the majority, in this case white, when we're breaking down a race, they have these kind of oppressive mindset, and so if you're someone who doesn't fit into that category, you've experienced where you go through a certain community and you're looked at in a strange way. I could say the same thing anecdotally. There are communities in this country where I don't look like the people that predominantly live there, and I get strange looks if I'm there. And if we go to the data, the most recent studies, I believe it's the Bureau of Justice Statistics in 2018, show that blacks are 48 times more likely to commit a violent crime against whites than vice versa. So the idea that we don't talk about any of this, that we just say, oh, no, whites are the oppressor, they have this privilege, and other people have this subjective feeling where they feel like that they're being treated unfairly or being abused. But the actual data on the crime show that the narrative's quite the opposite of what we're told. Now, I'm not saying this to somehow say, oh, woe is white people, something like that. I'm just saying this is the problem when you start playing the intersectional game and saying people are privileged or oppressed based on their race. I could talk to people that have subjective reality that are white that would say, I feel like as a white person that I'm the most oppressed person because I'm poor, I get screwed over by the legal system as well, and there's no groups in the establishment that are advocating for me. They all say that I have privilege. Now, are we going to deny that person's subjective reality? I choose not to focus on this sort of racial identitarianism, and I think that the ultimate oppressed person...
Holy shit, dude.
Yes. Well, that's not even controversial.
Okay. What do you mean? That's okay. All right. So I'm gonna stop you because I wanna fill in some gaps here because you are, boy, you're all over the fucking place, dude. All right, so first of all, you're really, my guy, you're totally missed every single time. Every single time. I feel like I have to constantly reread the definition of intersectionality because you're just constantly changing it to a different thing to fit whatever narrative you're trying to talk about all the time. No one is using intersectionality to say that people are like more oppressed or not oppressed.
Yes,
Like that's not like no one is walking like I want to know why like it's you don't seem to have any sort of concurrent evidence that this is happening.
Did
Like,
the Washington Post, it's an editor for the Washington Post, just say that their white women are lucky that blacks aren't coming after them for revenge? Did that happen? An editor for the Washington Post?
what do you have more to say?
The editor for the Washington Post, who I believe was a black woman, said that white women, Karens, are lucky that blacks aren't coming after them for revenge. Did that happen?
Uh, what does that have to do with anything that we're discussing?
Because the idea, people are using intersectionality and this identity politics of grievance culture and victimhood to say that based on my group, I'm allowed to go after another group. Sure.
Okay, so I will ask you two things. Was it an actual like sourced article or was it an op-ed? Because if it's an op-ed, I am probably gonna just think it's just bullshit. Because op-eds are just written by people. Like there's not a lot of like fact checking. They're just people's opinion.
But it's someone in a position of power's opinion. Look, we can see this. We see the 1619 project.
Someone who writes an op-ed in the New York Times does not have politicized power. They just write a dumb op-ed in like, what?
I mean, I think that it's a denial of reality to say that there aren't people that are pushing sort of this racial or gender narrative and going after people they see as perceived oppressor groups in that. I think we see that all around us.
Okay. Do you think someone like me is going after it?
I'm taking you at your word that no, that's not what you're doing. But I'm saying that this is what intersectionality is being used. I'm not the only person. I could bring up at least 3 articles right now that I had up for this debate where people in academia who identify as leftists have said this is the same problem they have with intersectionality, that it encourages fanaticism and extremism.
Okay, so like I have issues with it too, but my issues aren't how it's being used. My issues are that it's become a buzzword by liberals. And it's become a buzzword by right-wing reactionary. I am not a right-wing reactionary, and I am not a liberal. So it's very hard for me to have these conversations with both sides. Because, like, I don't like identity politics. Like, at the end of the day, identity politics are frustrating as fuck, and they're not very productive. Because people weaponize them.
Can you define what you mean by identity politics? Is that fair to ask?
How do you not know what IDPOL is?
No, I know what I think it is, but I also knew what I thought intersectionality was, and we sort of disagree on how it's being used. So by identity politics, are you talking about...
We don't disagree on how it's being used. Like, I feel like you disagree with the definition.
Okay, let me ask you this. Do you think identity politics is only identity based on things like immutable characteristics such as race and gender? Or could you have identity politics based on political affiliation, such as Republican, Democrat?
Sorry, I mismuted. Identity politics is just the tendency.
I think I lost.
You seem to cut out.
Am I still muted?
I can hear you now.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Sorry. So, like, all IDPOL really is just a tendency for people of a particular group. It doesn't matter what their background is to form like just exclusive politic based on their existence. And it's so like Democrats hanging out with Democrats. Or like black Democrats hanging out with black Democrats, white Republicans hanging out with white Republicans, non-white Republicans hanging out with non-white Republicans. It's just the culmination of like-minded people with like-minded ideas. Okay. That's really all IDPOL really is, and so like it creates kind of a cesspool of an echo chamber, and like I don't like that because I think we need to have lots of diverse thought. Like I think fucking IDPOL is stupid as shit. Like, I'm not here to debate IDPOL because I don't like IDPOL. Like, I think IDPOL is reductionist. It doesn't help anyone.
Okay.
So, like, if you want concede anything. Like,
Okay, but then I'll just pull up the definition of intersectionality that I was reading before this debate, and then you could reread yours again and explain to me how the identity politics isn't crucial to intersectionality. So let me read this. Intersectionality, noun, the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. That's identity politics, focused on these group identities and the disadvantages or privilege that they get as a part of those identities.
Identities is idpol, like even the Merriam-Webster definition of idpol is just politics in which groups of people having a particular racial or religious, ethnic, or social culture identity tend to promote their own self-interest or concerns without the larger concerns of another political group. That's all it is.
How is intersectionality not reliant on that?
Because no one is using it to promote a particular group. They're basically just saying, hey, there are other oppressions, we should probably talk about them so we can make things more egalitarian for other people that might be suffering those inequalities.
The movement, the movement that's dominating our discourse right now is called Black Lives Matter. Now, the fact that we're now going to claim that that's not a group promoting an identity, I mean, I just don't think that that's living in reality. I think clearly we see intersectionality taking to the streets right now, and it's one of the dominant things. The same with the book White Fragility. These are taking identity politics, and it's using intersectionality to say these certain groups are oppressors.
Are you really this upset at like a book that okay?
It's nothing to do with being upset. We're debating whether or not it's a good thing. I think it's a terrible thing.
That's not what it wasn't what I was trying to say here, buddy. So, like, I mean, the problem with idpol is a very echoey chamber kind of thing. Like, it really is. And, like, I don't like idpol. I think idpol's garbage. I'm not advocating for idpol. What I'm saying is intersectionality is supposedly, when used correctly, not weaponized, and not done in any sort of silly way, it's meant to basically highlight the framework of lots of different oppressions among lots of different. So, like, when I think of intersectionality, I think of I have more in common with the struggle of working class whites than I do with rich people. Doesn't matter whether they're black or white or whatever. I have more in common. It's the same thing. Like, most working class white people have more in common with working class black folks. And having that lens to examine that is what intersectionality is about. Identity politics boils the idea where everyone just kind of goes in their own little echo chamber of oppression or whatever particular group they want to sort of stylize, and they sort of kind of get all that, they sort of like, and they just echo their own like oppressions. Like, all the trans people like talk about trans things, all the queer people talk about queer things, all black folks talk about black things. It's just like, and it just becomes a very negative space with no sort of feedback of like, hey, we're all actually more oppressed, and like all these oppressions don't actually like equate to the same thing. And like I said, I don't like idpol. Like, idpol is not necessarily intersectionality, and intersectionality is not necessarily idpol. They're not the same thing. They sound really fucking similar, but they're not.
But if I may, and this is something that I see happen. Maybe we're just in two different realities, because I see this all over the place. I saw it constantly.
What do you mean two different realities?
Because you keep saying you don't see anyone. No, wait 1 second. You keep saying you haven't seen any of this used. I see it all over the place. I see it used all the time to talk about certain groups having privilege based on their identity and other groups not having that privilege. Everything you just said there is exactly why I argue against intersectionality. Yes, the idea of focusing on the perceived oppression of a group based on their...
exists, my guy. Like, privilege fucking exists. Can you acknowledge... Okay, so let me... All right, can you acknowledge that privilege actually exists? Like, do you think that privilege doesn't exist?
No, privilege exists. Okay. Now, if I can finish my point, and then I'll get to that, if I can finish my point. But the argument that you made that, yes, poor working class white people have more in common with poor working class black people than they do with rich white people. And a poor working class white person has more in common with someone in the inner city community than they do LeBron James. And LeBron James has more in common with Donald Trump than he does with, right? So the idea that this is focused just on the privilege of someone based on their race is nonsense. Now, as to whether privilege exists, of course privilege exists. For example, I'm one of for example, the fact that us three right now are alive in the United States of America at this time in 2020, and we have access to the internet, and we're seemingly relatively healthy, that makes us in the 99th percentile of the most privileged people in the history of the world.
You're completely diluting the concept by saying that.
That's exactly the point.
That's not what people. But that's not what people use it for. Like this is a total fucking cherry pick.
No, but that's exactly my point. That it is diluted. That we focus on these small areas of perceived
privilege.
Does
this though? This is what I'm saying.
Yes,
like, this is a
Black Lives Matter.
This is 100% a right wing.
Okay. Let's stop for a second. Okay, Rob, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. I think we are seeing. We're quite literally seeing this all around us. We're literally seeing the predominant movement in the country right now called Black Lives Matter. And even when people say, well, no, all lives matter, the argument is, well, see, that's disvaluing Black lives because Black Lives Matter was a specific movement because of the oppression they're facing, which is fine. Like, I don't mind them having that discussion. That's reasonable. But the idea that we're going to pretend that this isn't based on identity politics and this isn't intersectionality being used to say that one group based on racial issues are having a grievance and saying that another group has privilege, that's nonsense. This is occurring all around us every day. And it's becoming toxic. It's leading to all kinds of crazy things. For example, in the name of supporting Black Lives Matter protests and canceling people that disagree with this, we see all sorts of people being shot and killed, like an 8-year-old that was killed in Atlanta just the other day. But that doesn't get focused because instead of focusing on how horrific that is and the fact that we should be trying to eliminate homicides of people of all color, particularly in inner city communities, instead we're focused on just a specific issue that a specific political group that's using identity politics wants to talk about.
But the thing is like all lives matter, like misses.
Yo,
like sorry, am I still
no
there?
problem.
Sorry.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm on push to talk. I'm sorry. No, like the idea of all lives matter is a direct pushback to what BLM is. BLM isn't proposing that like black people are the most oppressed. BLM is just proposing that hey, we are still being indefeatably discriminated by police brutality, and we just want it to stop. That's really all that's all that slogan was for, and that's all that slogan was talking about. No one in the BLM movement or no one that knows the brutality of law enforcement doesn't unacknowledge that like white folks get brutalized by the cops all the time. I hate that shit too. I'm not like a fan of the fact that there are no knock orders have been done on white people that can legally grow weed in their house. There was like a really big case of I can't remember the guy's name, but like he was swatted or something and they like shot him or shot his dog and it was a big fucking deal. You know what I mean? Like that shit sucks. Like I don't want that either. I don't like police brutality. You know what? I'll say ACAB all day. Like I'm not a huge fan. You know, like fuck them too. Like, you know, fuck the police and shit.
Well, so, I don't agree with that, but fair enough. But that's a different discussion, obviously. But again, like the idea, intersectionality, it is specifically intertwined with identity politics, and even the definitions we're reading.
It might be by certain people, but it's not this broad mainstream determination. Like every person that I've ever talked to, every activist that I've ever talked to, never uses it in this light. Like, how many people on the left do you talk to? How many activists? Like, have you been to protests? Have you talked to people on the other side of the political side? Like, how much have you asked them? Like, I'm like, I feel like you walked in this entire debate assuming that I was going to be one of those people that was going to fulfill all of those needs and boxes that you had about this topic. And I'm virulently telling you that none of that shit is even remotely fucking true. Well, it just sounds to me that every single thing you walked in was like, she's going to say this, that, and the other thing. And I never said I believe in any of the things that you're sort of posturing that I would believe in, like at all.
Well, I'm not saying that you're saying. I'm not saying that you're saying that, and nor did I walk in thinking you would. What I'm saying is the reason that I asked you to define it and give your opinion on it at first was because I'm saying that my experience is that people are using this differently than what you're using it the tool of intersectionality and the academic study of it. They're using it differently. Again, we could go to liberal sources such as Jonathan Haidt and Heterodux Academy, where he talks about how intersectionality is now in fact. We had 5,000, for example, scientists sign on to have a day where we didn't use STEM, science, technology, education, and math, because STEM is racist. We've had academics in feminist departments and critical race theory departments say that the Enlightenment is bad because it comes from the West, and anything that comes from the West needs to be rejected. We have courses that literature course. Good.
Wait, cool. Like, just like I feel like this is just like a cherry pick. Like you're just picking out like insane liberals that say some crazy opinion, and you're just passing it off as statistical fact that everyone believes it.
I'm not saying everyone believes it. I'm saying that the ideology of intersectionality has led to increased radicalism discussing these sorts of things, and it makes sense.
So let me. I want to ask like a couple things, just because I'm trying to figure out where you're at here.
Okay.
So, do you understand my political position? Because I'm not sure if you do.
I think. Would you like me to try to say what I think it is, at least regarding intersectionality? Sure. I think that your position is that it's worth looking at whether or not that there are people that are oppressed based on these immutable characteristics, but you also acknowledge that people of all races, genders, etc., could be oppressed based on these immutable characteristics.
Okay, so what do you think my actual like political tendency or background is?
I mean, if I use context clues, you have a hammer and sickle behind you, and you're saying ACAB. I'd assume you probably lean towards Marxism.
Okay,
just using context clues.
Okay, well, the reason why I'm asking is because like you're using a lot of liberal talking points, and I'm just trying to see if you. Okay, so I don't. The problem with this conversation a little bit is that you're dumping a lot of these like super liberalized talking points that I also kind of don't agree on either. Like I'm not a fan, and this isn't a hammer and sickle fact, but it doesn't matter.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well,
no, don't worry about it. Who cares? It's fucking fun. Like you know what? If someone came into my house and burned this, I don't really give a shit, dude. So I was just curious because like, if I were to say,
1 second. The first person in chat who guesses what that flag is gets VIP.
No.
Continue.
Oh wait, no, they have to actually guess like
what it is. They can't just say Juche flag. They can't say that.
They can't just say Juche flag. Holy shit! They got to say like the whole wait, Dylan, can they say the acronym or do they have to?
The acronym works.
Okay. All right, I can't wait to see. Yeah, don't look it up. Okay, I was just curious because so if there was anything that flag, holy shit, dude. If there was anything that I guess me and you could agree on, Rob, is that I'm not a fan of fucking liberal shit, and you're not a fan of liberals either. So like I guess there are some things we can agree on. My frustration with this conversation is you're posturing a lot of these like ridiculous sort of like one-off moments when liberals just say the most ridiculous shit, and assuming that like this is kind of my position, and it's really not. Like
well, I'm not trying to say it. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm not trying to say, but like I'm just trying to make sure because I like I said, like I'm a communist. I'm a Marxist-Leninist. So like I don't like I'm not on the side of liberals, you know. So I don't like these people any more than you do, but I'm not a fan of the righties. You know what I mean?
Sure. I think that Marxists are a lot of sort of the Marxist ideology. I think that a lot, not saying
I disagree. I don't like. This is the thing is I am literally trying to give you the Marxist perspective of how like a lot of the big feminist movements in the United States, like some of the biggest equality movements, were Marxist feminist movements led by trans people and led by Black folks. This is a part of history that you almost never like hear because it's been sort of whitewashed or removed from American history because of the radicism behind it. And so you would never know that's a lot of the like the 40-hour work week in America, a lot of the labor rights laws like OSHA, a lot of these things were created and fought by American socialists. Like the Haymarket riots, all of these things. Stonewall. I can name like countless riots and countless like little uprising movements in the United States that actually got us rights, that got us things that we all enjoy today. And a lot of them were socialist, Marxist, communist, whatever. That's where they were. Um, my huge and so like you're not really arguing with my talking points. You're sort of like arguing with like the liberalized ones that you've heard, and you think that my background is equitable to these people, and I'm trying to tell you that they're not.
Well, no, I'm
Like,
not.
and I've also given you the definition of intersectionality like 4 times, and every single time, and if anyone wants to clip the bot, every single time I have like given you this, you've always come back with a kind of a more different version of it, and I'm like, that's not what I'm saying, like at all.
But
So,
look, the definition that you gave is rife with
Do you want-
identity politics.
how? Okay, do you want me to just fucking post it in chat or something? Like, is like
But-
so
but
we
I'm
can
not
chat and look at it?
But what the difference is this: you're saying, "Here's my definition." This doesn't have anything to do with identity politics.
This isn't my definition, buddy. This is off of Merriam-Webster.com. So, like, humor me for a second. You keep saying it's like my definition, like I just made this
It's
up.
yours in the context that it's the one you're presenting as that you agree with. That's what I'm saying. In the context of this debate, it's your definition.
No, if we want to go back to the beginning of the conversation, I said I am going to read you the definition of intersectionality from a fucking dictionary website, and that I am going to talk about how I view intersectionality, because I don't necessarily agree that the way people use it is correct. And I say people on the right don't use it correctly, and people on the left don't always use it correctly. So I'm trying to provide you the best example of how people use it. That is literally it. I mean, you have pivoted so many fucking times.
I've not. Like, you're literally arguing now that because I said it's your definition because it's the one you provided,
that's not
that somehow
really
that
correct.
implies I meant you wrote the definition. I'm not saying that.
That's not a correct logic train, though. You can't say that. Like,
sure, it's a common colloquialism. That's what we say. If you
colloquialism,
right?
Okay.
I mean, it seems like
so. I'm gonna take moderator privileges. So I'm just because this is not productive. This is just arguing over language. So I'm gonna get. It is the definition that Mel is using that she believes is the correct one. Right. Mel, would you agree to that? You believe that this is the correct definition because from Merriam-Webster?
I literally just pulled it off of the fucking internet.
Yeah. So
and then I elaborated, like, I don't necessarily agree with this descriptive because I feel like the description is a little weak and doesn't really cut to what the term actually means.
So
and I explained that shortly after, and then every time I tried to talk about it, he would change it a little, and I'm like, well, that's not what I was actually trying to get here. So then it would go.
Okay, but see, this is where I'm confused, because if you were to ask me to provide a definition for something and then I would provide it, I did not get the vibe that you were saying, here's the definition I'm providing. Oh, by the way, I don't agree with it. And it makes the debate difficult because you keep saying I'm
I didn't agree. I never said I didn't agree with it. I said that this doesn't fit, like, because you asked me at the very beginning. You know, I said, hey, I'm going to give you, I said this, I'm going to give a definition, and then I'm going to give sort of like my interpretation on how I feel about this idea.
Okay,
I did both of them.
Let me try to pull back.
That was an elaboration. That was all it was.
Okay, let me try a good faith effort.
It wasn't giving me a concrete, like, this is my line. I very clearly stated that.
Okay, let me try to give a good faith effort. Forget the definition. Let me just ask some things of you, and you could give your interpretation if you think that that's a correct use or a productive use of intersectionality. Was that fair? Okay.
I'll appeal to that. That's fine.
Okay. So do you think saying that white people have privilege based on their skin color is a correct use of intersectionality?
Correct use of intersectionality? I mean, I don't think there needs to be intersectionality to determine that white people have privilege. Like, privilege and intersectionality are not mutually exclusive, like, conversations. I would say that, like, you would use intersectionality as, like, okay, I think of intersectionality overall as all intersectionality is. It's a concept. It's not a theory. It's not something that people can just, like, look up and define indefinitely. All it is it's the concept of describing experiences of lots of different oppressions without explaining necessarily the causes, but trying to figure out what the root causes of those oppressions are, which usually lie institutionally or systemically. So, like, as someone who is a person of color, a woman, a trans person, all that shit, there are things that I experience that are worse in some of those and better in some of the other ones. That's literally all this boils down to. It's just cross-examining different experiences. And a lot of people would find out that working class white people have a lot in common with some of the most marginalized folks in the United States than they do, say, Donald Trump. But a lot of white folks really do think that Donald Trump and them are like equal in terms of like privilege, class, power, prominence, and all those things. So all it is just reevaluating your positioning in the world. That's really what it is. That's all this term means. It is just a concept. It isn't like this theorized, like weaponized term that means a million things. It's just simply a concept that we apply to help explain inequality systemically and institutionally, and it helps us solve problems. It is merely a tool in the toolbox. That is essentially what I use it for, and what I think everyone should use it for. People, yes, can take it and say, oh, well, that means white privilege. But like, white privilege is a completely separate conversation. We are arguing the concept of whether intersectionality is good or bad. I am assuming that I'm taking the position that this is good, and I'm assuming you are taking the position that it is bad. But through this entire conversation, you have not displayed to me at all why you think it is ultimately bad. You kind of dance around it.
That's not true. I've been very direct. In fact, my initial statement was that I feel that when we focus on grouping people in categories such as race, gender, etc.,
but that can be done outside of intersectionality, though. That is the thing that I'm
right. But intersectionality and how it's practiced that we see in that.
You don't need an intersectional lens to figure out that like you might vibe more with white folks than black folks. That's the thing. It's like I don't think you understand how this is used as correctly, and maybe because you've never used it. I'm not sure. Like
that again. If I could finish your point, okay,
I'll let you go. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. I think that oftentimes, although you're using it in a particular way, that's not the way we see it used academically. That's not the way that we see it being used politically. That's not the way we see it being used institutionally in society today. We see that it's being used for sort of a grievance culture and to be focused on particular races and saying that other particular races are oppressors. We see that it's being used in gender. We see that it's being used with sexual preference and things like that. In addition, the idea that, well, we could use other tools to be able to get to the concept of white privilege, then why is intersectionality? Can't we use other tools than intersectionality to be able to find out if particular groups have been marginalized in our history? Like, so the argument, it seems like a non sequitur. It's like, well, on one hand, all the stuff that you're saying is negative could happen anyways without intersectionality. But on the other hand, intersectionality is uniquely necessary to discuss these privileges.
Well, because there's certain things that you can't identify as well. So, like, we can see systemic problems. So what I'm saying is, like, we can see that there are systemic issues with lots of different people. But sometimes when it comes to white privilege or class privilege or other things, they're a lot harder to see on the surface. Because, like, we can look at inequality. Like, we can see, I can drive through a bad neighborhood, and I can see lots of issues, lots of problems. But I might not know that those problems that those people are facing are maybe similar things that I face, or similar things that other people that are also working class folks might face as well. So it's basically just another way to sort of look at the micro level instead of the macro level. That's all it really is for. It's just atomizing some things that we can figure out. Hey, if there's systemic issues happening, like broadly, how intrinsically are they affecting everybody else? Like I said, it's just merely a tool.
Okay, but even in that world, here's a problem I have. I have many, but here's another one that I have. I think that if we're going to specifically hamper in on oppression and privilege and things like that, that the end result is, as we start to branch these categories out, which we can see in intersectionality. So maybe it started initially with things like sexual preference, started with things such as race, gender, and then it branched out to ableism, and then it could branch out to religion. It could branch out to all of the seemingly an infinite categorization that we could say, well, this group has some sort of systemic oppression against them. I think that we'll find that the end result is that the most oppressed group is the individual. which means that discussions of oppression based on group identity ultimately boil down when you take it to its logical extension, because it could work something like this. Well, we need to look at the unique oppression of this person who is white but is a woman and is straight. So we need to look at that unique oppression. But then there's also a different unique oppression when we look at the next person who's maybe black and a woman and straight. But then the third unique oppression, and the problem is that it oversimplifies exactly the fact that everyone faces oppression and privilege in their life, and we should look at it on an individual basis.
It doesn't oversimplify anything. It basically it's a tool for some people that don't always that can't always identify certain problems. So like imagine if I've noticed that there are so many people, so many white folks that originally didn't really understand like the BLM movement, or didn't understand like what class consciousness was, or didn't really understand what the racial disparities were. And as they started to see the reactions from the state, and see the reactions from governments, and see the reactions of fellow citizens, a lot of people were kind of like, oh, maybe like things are actually not as great for these people. And so like you kind of look at it through that lens as well. It's like you realize, okay, I've had things bad, but I don't have things as bad as these folks. So like truly, we call ourselves one of the most free and equitable places in the world, but it still doesn't feel to be as free, for them as opposed to us. And so it's sort of just like coming to terms with how your privilege is. That's all it really is. It's not trying to assign the stacking of oppression. I'm actually against that, because when you stack the oppressions onto people, you sort of minimize and atomize people's experiences to just oppression, and that's not how we should look at this. I mean,
okay, but that's identity politics. We can which you claim.
That's not identity politics,
yes.
My dude. Like
you defined it.
How was that identity politics?
Because you just said, I noticed that white folks don't understand that the system's stacked against black folks.
That's not it, Paul. That's literally just like that's just how racialized this country is. It's kind of fucking obvious by now.
So I think it's a mistake to look at this and the oversimplification of saying this particular group white is privileged, this particular group black is oppressed. I think that's a mistake to break things down, because what ends up happening is we see things like, for example, this sort of mindset allows Snoop Dogg to post on Twitter yesterday a picture of a bunch of black conservatives and call them coons. And we see the vitriol that people that don't identify as Joe Biden, for goodness sake, said, if you're black and you don't vote for me, you're not really black. This is the sort of insanity. And this isn't one-off things. These are people in positions of cultural or political power that are engaged in this sort of rhetoric. So I disagree with it because it leads to heinous things on that level. But if we are going to accept that we should do this and play this, look at it through the lens of, is a particular group privileged or are they oppressed? The truth is, all groups, whether it be racial groups, gender groups, sexual preference groups, etc., are both simultaneously privileged and oppressed at the same time. So, for example, given a bunch of factors, it could indeed be oppressing to be a black person. But there are also situations in this country right now where it is a privilege to be a black person. And so boiling it down to the...
What privilege? Okay, so like systemic institutional racism. Do you believe that this exists?
Name me one institution right now that disagrees with Black Lives Matter.
That's not the question I asked you.
But wait, fundamentally...
Can you answer the question?
Yes.
Do you believe that systemic racism exists? Yes or no?
Yes.
Do you believe that systemic racism affects brown and black people more than white people? Yes
it depends on the situation. No.
Yes or no?
No, I don't.
Why?
Because the world's a complicated place, and that's a gross oversimplification. For example, are we talking about just the United States? But are we talking about just the United States? Are we talking about just now?
Okay. Hey, I'm merely trying to sort of understand where your argument is. Like where your feelings are here, buddy. I'm not trying to bait you into anything.
No,
I'm not trying to set you up.
But that's
man, chat. I'm just reading chat a little bit, and they seem to think that I'm like I'm doing this to you. I'm like, I'm not. But all right.
No.
You never do that. Never read chat. That's a
doomsday
prophecy.
I have it up on my phone, but I'm not really. But no, I'm giving you a sincere answer.
I missed the first time. Okay, it's actually the first time I peeked at chat all game or all day, except for the DPRK thing. So I was just like. Anyway, yeah,
No, my honest answer is no, because we have to define the parameters and what system are we talking about? For example, if we say just the statement you said, do I believe black and brown people are more affected by systemic racism? Are we talking worldwide? Are we talking just the United States?
oh
Right?
my god. Of course we're talking about the country you live in, my guy. Like,
But,
come
but,
on,
but
now you're
wait,
just being
but wait,
silly.
it's not that simple. That's
Oh
the
my
point,
God.
though. It's
Okay,
no.
okay. Do you want me? Would you like me? Would you like me to start asking for specific examples, tutor? You know, because I can't.
Right. So
I
let me
mean,
give you some specific examples. So let's say that we go back to the policing argument and we say, okay, we could say that as a black person, and I'm willing to concede this, that there is some debate on how much, but as a black person, you're more likely to have adversarial relationships with the police than white people. Okay,
yeah.
I'll say that.
So,
Okay.
okay. If okay.
Okay.
All
All right. So then, but we could say in other circumstances, it's actually more beneficial to be black than white. For example, if you are in academia, it is more beneficial to be black than white. Now, your chances of getting into higher ed might be lower, but once you're there, it's certainly advantageous to be a person of color. There are specific programs for you. Schools are chomping at the bit to get their diversity numbers up. So there's all sorts.
Why do you think that is though? Like that's the thing. It's like so. I want to so like so we can. Okay, so I'll meet you halfway here.
Okay.
So we can agree that affirmative action like exists. Like we can agree, right? Affirmative action's a thing. I don't necessarily like affirmative action because I believe it hurts everyone. I do think that it was a measure that people looked at and were like, hey, if we put more of these people in, we can create equality through arbitration, which I think is the worst way to strengthen diversity. I think diversity should just naturally happen. Let people sort of figure shit out. I don't like this idea of forcing people in like categories and boxes, pushing people into places that might not exactly cater to them. Because when you force people into a diverse environment, you can also create friction that didn't even exist there or didn't need to be there. So yeah, so I'll agree with you, I guess. Affirmative action is bad. Don't agree with that shit.
Well, good, but it's not just affirmative action. Go ahead, I'll let you finish.
Well, wait. Yeah, Mel wanted to finish that.
So my question to you is like, do you think? Okay, so what's a really simple topic? Okay, so do you think that we have systemic racism in the prison industrial complex?
It's a tough question because we have to ask ourselves, for example, what is the factors that are. I know the data shows that, for example, blacks seem to be disproportionately put into those systems. The question is, at what level are there other factors than racism? But I will say that without getting into an hours-long debate on that, I would say that there probably is racism that's involved at some level, making that situation where blacks probably face a harsher judgment in our criminal justice system than whites. So I will say yes. I don't know that it's to the degree that people. I think that there are other factors, but okay. I'll say that could be a factor.
I guess I'm curious because you seem to, and I'm not trying to like. I don't want to misread you, and I don't want to be disingenuous, and I don't want to like sort of. I don't want to misframe any of your arguments here. I'm just trying to figure out like where your stances are, because I feel like this is the first time we've actually really talked or engaged. I feel like whenever we've been on panel shows together, we've never really really had a chance to like explain positions. I think like when I show up on panel shows with you, I just kind of say my shit, you say your shit, and I mean, you know, like I'm a combative asshole. We all know this. Like, you know, I fight people all the time. I'm not scared. And so I'm trying to figure out like where you are all the time in terms of like positions, because it seems to me you're kind of all over the place. In the sense that like only in this regard. So like there's kind of an inconsistency in the sense that you think that there are certain what was it? You think that there are certain oppressions that exist in one system, but not really in others. And so, like when I look at systemic oppression, I usually look at it as like across the board type thing.
That's a mistake. So like, that's what I think's a mistake. Because I think that it's way more complicated. For example, if I could ask you a question real quick, this isn't a trap. Do you think that there is systemic oppression of women in this country?
Of course.
Okay. Do you think that there's systemic oppression of women in our criminal justice system?
I think it very much depends, but I would say no.
Okay. Do you think there's systemic oppression of men in our criminal justice system?
What kind of oppression are you talking
Like, for
about?
example, all data that we could point to that shows that there's oppression from blacks to whites, such as things like the likelihood to be pulled over, the likelihood to be charged with a crime.
Of course, I would say that, like, yeah, of course, I would say that, like, there's obviously like more oppression of men in prison because like men commit the most crimes because the most dangerous. Okay, but can I finish? Here?
Sure.
That because most men commit the most crimes, they are involved in the most dangerous work. They are the majority of a lot of workforces that have these things happen. So of course, men are going to be in prison. Like it's kind of like men are in a position of in society where they're always going to be at this sort of subjugated level. So of course.
Okay, but then that's exactly the argument I'm making when we look at the difference when you say is there systemic oppression towards blacks with the criminal justice system. Well, the data shows that they commit more crimes, so we need to look at exactly what proportion of it's racism, and the same with men. What proportion of it's sexism, what proportion of it's cultural things, and things like that. So I think that so now when we look at intersectional actions, we can see that intersectionality is predominantly talked about in two fields of academia. One is feminism, and the other is critical race theory. And so the same people that tell us that we live in a patriarchy and the system's oppressive towards women then have to admit, well, yes, but with the criminal justice system, it is more, our criminal justice system is more sexist than it is racist. Yet I don't hear a big intersectional push for men's lives matter or the abuse uniquely of men from the criminal justice system.
Because men still, like through the patriarchal standards of the world, men still hold the most amount of privileges. I don't as someone who genuinely believes in most feminist ideas, like I don't think, I honestly am frustrated like with the state of like men advocating for child rights and shit. I think that's like deplorable. The fact that like women generally get the preferential treatment as the fair sex towards children because they are the child bearers. I'm actually like horrendously against the fact that like men who are generally better fathers or are the more capable person in that child court case lose out on holding on to their children because of that. Like I don't necessarily, like I said, like it's the problem is like you have to look at it too. Like, are we defining men? Or are we defining black men? Because if I were to say just replace men with black men and white and women with black women, the entire argument is different. So like, would you say that like black men are disproportionately? Because I mean, like, it's overwhelmingly that there are more black male bodies in prisons than there are white male bodies.
But again, that's not. So now we're getting more specific. But again, if you were talking about the gravest injustice based on one group, or the gravest disparity, I don't want to say injustice, then clearly the difference between how men are treated by the criminal justice system versus women is the predominant disparity, even more so than from black to white. And so right now, the movement isn't Black men's lives matter. The movement is Black Lives Matter. Why is intersectionality focused on the category that's not even the biggest disparity? And the reason, we all know the reason, we know it. It's because intersectionality puts certain groups, as you kind of said it there, although I think you're making a more fair and nuanced point, but they believe that men are more privileged, that men are a privileged class. And so therefore, when we take a specific instance where we can see men are underprivileged, that within law enforcement, ironically, the same argument that we're having all of these discussions about in our country, the criminal justice system. So on one hand, we're admitting with Black Lives Matter, this is the most important thing, mistreatment by the criminal justice system. But when we show that men are more adversely affected by that, the same intersectional peoples tend to be like, well, black men, we'll just focus on black men. This is exactly my criticism.
I don't think, but this is the problem is like, I don't think anyone is doing this. Like, I'm not like, I can't disagree
you just
with this because, but like, no one is like, I just like, every single thing that you've brought here is just like a bunch of like shrilling about how like certain groups are experiencing this. So like, well, if we don't talk about one group, then that's like, I really want to know like who was telling you that, like who was giving you these arguments, like obviously men are affected more in the criminal justice system. Like if that's your big fucking gotcha to like blow me the fuck out, like obviously like it's true. Like I'm like no one's arguing with that. Like
it's not a gotcha.
I wasn't even.
I'm not trying to do a gotcha.
It's like you were bringing it up, like you were trying to bring it up, like it was something that I was genuinely trying to talk about, and I'm like, that's not my point.
The point,
like,
Dylan, did you
like
want to
this
say
is we're talking about like, I mean, the intersectional out, like we're talking about intersectionality, not like fucking like prison shit. Like that's not what we're on here.
Right, but the
Like-
problem, this is, again, and I've noticed this in a lot of debates I have, and I'm not claiming bad faith or anything like that, but it seems that a lot of the times we have this discussion, people just say, well, this is how I view this particular thing, and I'm not talking about the other people, which is fine, and that's fair to you.
That's not what I was saying
think,
at all. That's not what I was saying.
You keep saying no one's saying this. Where are you coming up with these arguments? Literally everyone's saying. Well, not literally everyone. Many people are saying this.
That's a really big leap without any sort of data, without any sort of study, without any sort of like
you want me to bring up
evidence to basically like back any of that up. Like, who is the everyone?
You want me to bring up the Bureau?
Everyone.
So wait, so your argument is you're truly saying here that people aren't out there focusing exclusively on Black Lives Matter. You're truly saying that, or you're saying
what?
that are you truly saying that there aren't people out there focusing specifically on Black lives in the criminal justice system, or is your argument that there are the equivalent, speaking of men's lives in the criminal justice system?
Because at this point, in terms of like conversation, Black lives is the thing that people are focusing on. Like that's just the thing that's what people are focusing on at this current moment. Like sure, like the thing. So like okay. Look, when we look at oppression, generally speaking, when we examine various oppressions of lots of different people, the more marginalized people, once they get lifted up out of the oppressions, it sort of highlights the inequalities of everyone involved. It's not that no one gives a shit about white men. It's the fact that at this point, there are people that are suffering at a monumentally worse point in society than white men. It's not that nobody cares.
Based on what? So we're talking about the criminal justice system. That's what the George Floyd protests are over. So can you explain to me?
It's not even just George Floyd. It's an entire movement. Like BLM started in about like 2014.
About the criminal justice system and police interactions with.
Yeah.
Okay. So again,
there are a lot of people that there are a lot of people also that are looking at police brutality through other lenses as well. I think it's disingenuous to say that like the whole like, well, no one's talking about white male lives just seems kind of like a pretty privileged thing to say.
I totally disagree. I think that it's disingenuous to imply that there's anywhere near a commiserate conversation about men being negatively affected by police versus Black Lives Matter. I just think that that's not reality. It's nowhere near being close. Nike's not putting up ads saying men's lives matter.
Are you trying to say that we should focus on like all men? Like, what is this your argument? That it's just like all men?
It's the opposite. That when we start to break things down based on these intersectional groups, that what ends up happening is we lose focus of the real. For example, we had what used to be called classical liberalism.
How are we losing focus? Like, I feel like when you focus on a marginalized group and you lift them up, you subvertly find how inequitable a lot of things are. Well, that's essentially that's essentially what happens. Like the most marginalized people, as they get lifted up, you start to find cracks in the wall, and more people find out how many things are truly inequitable.
Again, at the same time, many of the same people, not saying you, but many of the same people involved in intersectionality that are talking about Black Lives Matter and the need to lift them up also talk about things such as toxic masculinity. And we can see that it's just true. Like, for example, the Thomas Jefferson statue. Just real quick.
Because you have to fucking address everything, dude.
Okay.
But that's the point. You should address everything. And when you're focusing on specific marginalized groups, which is what intersectionality seeks to do, then you focus on that and lose sight that there are other people that are suffering through things, and instead they're deemed to have privilege. For example, would it not be offensive to you? Let's say that, heaven forbid, you lose your home and you have a really tragic situation with your family and you become homeless. Wouldn't you find it the slightest bit offensive for people to then, based purely on your skin color, just one characteristic of you, to say, well, actually, you have privilege? And that's the sort of things that intersectionality leads to. So I'm not saying that we should hyper-focus on men. I'm saying we should look at the problem and say there is a problem with the criminal justice system and fix the criminal justice system. But when we start to hyper-focus on one specific group and say, it's about Black people, it does the opposite of lifting all groups up. It causes division. And so we can see the literal real-world implications, where Chase Bank, which was in charge for predatory lending to the inner-city Black communities in 2008, 2009, puts up a sign on their window that says Black Lives Matter, and all of a sudden, they're given forgiveness. It's like they're indulgence. That's insanity, and it's allowed to happen because of this focus on intersectionality that takes focus away off the holistic problem, which is there is a problem with corruption. There is a problem with the criminal justice system. Instead, we just focus on one group, and my point is that group's not even the most marginalized. The most marginalized, if you're talking about a specific group, is men compared to women. And yet none of the intersectional advocates that want to focus on specific groups that are going through specific problems seem to breathe a word about how there is a problem with the criminal justice system in men.
Okay, but the criminal justice system is overwhelmingly like the. Can I elaborate and say like the most despaired people right now are black males who are getting fucked by the police and the criminal justice system. So like you talk about men, but like the very men that are being screwed over are black men.
So are white men.
Okay, like cool, but it's still black men that face way more discriminatory practices. There's so much data, there's so much anecdotal andies to what is that's your entire argument.
It's not my argument is that when you focus specifically on these groups that you lose sight of the fact and you end up causing division.
No one is walking around just going, what about, I guess we don't care about the white man. Like, no one is doing this. Like, where is this? Like, where is this coming from?
It's literally when we see statues being pulled down, things like defund white people, white fragility, all of this stuff being discussed. I mean, this is happening every day in our life.
Because white people are finally realizing there's a lot, and it's not even, there are a lot of white folks that are finally realizing, hey, like, you know, I'm finally going through like a list of fucking oppressions, and I should probably acknowledge a lot of these oppressions. Blah 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 blah. Like, I don't like. What is the pulling down of statues have to do with this?
The idea is because we could see that the institutional power is behind Black Lives Matter at this point, and a lot of that institutional power is also based on the
institutions. What are institutions that
sure.
are
So I could name, for example, the corporations. That would be an institution. Corporate power.
Corporation isn't necessarily an institution.
Sure,
a corporation is a corporation.
Corporate power in the whole, not a specific corporation, but corporate power in the whole. Then we have the mainstream media. Then you have academia. Then you have Silicon Valley. Then you have the entertainment industry.
Can't you also understand that liberals just kind of go to whatever claw? Like it would be okay. For capitalism has to make money, right? We all know this, right? Capitalism has to make that money. It would be unbeneficial for profit motive to go against Black Lives Matter. Like, if a company came out and was like, man, fuck BLM, they would lose profits, they would lose support, they wouldn't have the backing. Like, okay, if you're not supporting BLM, it optically looks bad for you.
Same with academia and the entertainment industry.
That's not my point. My point is that corporations are naturally going to go with the thing that makes them the most amount of money and makes them look the best. It just makes sense. Like, okay. I can't imagine I can't imagine an American corporation not wanting to make money off of something regardless.
Okay, but that just proves my point. That's how powerful. That's how powerful Black Lives Matter is.
No, it's because they have changed a public opinion. It doesn't mean they're fucking powerful.
Yes, it does. If the corporations are afraid to go against an organization that one of their main tenets is, let's get rid of the nuclear family structure.